Well, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us again today. John, it's always good to be with you. How are you doing today?
Super chipper, Brandon. Super chipper. Really good. Thanks for asking.
Right on, right on. Well, today you and I are going to be discussing session 2 of the Discipleship Reframed. And really, this takes the next step in. We're going to be talking about outputs and outcomes. And there's two ways to look at this. We could talk about it being kind of a way of assessing ourselves really well, but also the measuring stick that'll kind of help us as we move forward in our process of building cultures of discipleship. And these ideas of outputs and outcomes, I think, get confused in the church world all the time. And we really look at outputs, kind of the things that we do as a way of measuring our success in the church, rather than such things as outcomes, which would be people being transformed and being healed and turning into the likeness of
Sure.
Christ.
Yep.
But John, before we really dive in, can you help us understand the difference between outputs and outcomes? Maybe a definition or an example of each that would really help us understand these two.
Yeah, that's great, Brandon. Let me do it in maybe a way of everyday life, like a recipe. In a recipe, when you make something, you have a certain amount of an ingredient that you mix with a certain amount of another ingredient, and then maybe you put it in the oven. I mean, outputs are what you do to make something, right? To prepare something, whereas outcomes is what comes out of the oven, right? And sometimes it's what you wanted, and sometimes it's not what you wanted. And I think that's the idea: is that outputs are things that we do, that we prepare, that we create, and then outcomes are what happens as a result of those outputs, people being involved in them. So another example would be like a sports team. Like an output for a sports coach would be, how many practices and how many drills do we want our players to go through? The outcomes, would be something like, how many games are we winning? How are we performing on the field? How many points did we score? And it would be ironic, though, right, if if a coach measured the success of their program. Their outcomes were how many fans came, or how much money was collected by the ticket office. And you can see the parallel here with churches, is that it's really important that we identify the difference between our outputs, the services that we're putting on, the classes, and all the different things that the staff and volunteers do, and then the outcomes. It's got to be more than just how many people come. And especially, of course, in today's world, with the COVID crisis and people not being able to come to the building, right? So I think that's the way I would say it, is that outputs are what we do, outcomes is what happens as a result within the lives of others as what we do.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, John. That's a really good distinction between that and one. The output, in essence, should lead to, well, an outcome.
Right.
But part of what we're going to talk about here is maybe we haven't quite really defined the outcomes really well. And for us, we break things down here in the Discipleship Reframed and at Kingdom Story into kind of four main pillars, four consistent priorities or plans that God has for our lives. We call those things: loving God, loving others, personal transformation, and influence. Well, John, can you tell us a little about each of those things and how we arrived at a place where we found these to be fundamental to the development of a disciple and a discipleship culture?
Sure, happy to do that. And I'll just say that these aren't unique, Brandon, to you and me. These are outcomes that, as I've shared these with other individuals, I've stolen them, I've heard them over the years, and I think they're really threaded all the way through the story, Genesis to Revelation. And as disciples of Jesus, though, we would for sure expect them that in his life and his example and his teachings, we'd find these four. And here's what we've landed on. The first two go together a little bit as a pair: is to love God and to love others. And Jesus, if you watch his life, his connection with his Father, his Abba, his turning around and laying down his life in so many ways, in relationships on the cross, etc. And and he gives that away to us, like, this is how you can sum up everything that from the scriptures, from my teachings, is to love God and love others. The third measuring stick, if you want to call it, the pillar that we use around outcomes, is personal transformation. The goal of a disciple in Jesus's time, and certainly for his disciples, the goal of a disciple was to become like the master. they would be transformed in the way they think, in the way they act, in the way they speak, in every way in their character to become like the master. And so, as hard as that was for the disciples, you think about denying Jesus on the night he was betrayed, the lack of ability to be like the master. It was the coming of the Holy Spirit that really allowed this personal transformation to bear the fruit of the Spirit, of character, patience, kindness, so that we can not only know and do, but we can be like Jesus. And the last one is influence. And of course, the difference that Jesus made outside of himself is, undisputable. The impact he had on other people when he met with them, and then he sent his disciples out 2 by 2 to be an influence, to preach and to teach and to do what he did, and to promise them that they would do greater things. So it's been my experience, Brandon, if you go through the scriptures, these threads run through and in so many different ways say the same things, and they weave together, they relate to each other. And so you show your love for God by loving others. If you're to be salt and light, well, your character is going to be the best sermon you can give. So they all weave together. And so anyway, Brandon, what's been fun for me is to watch you take on a new role at your church, New Life Foursquare, and you're the volunteer discipleship coordinator, and you're passionately leaning in to wanting to make this small church under new pastoral leadership to kind of grow in this culture of discipleship that we're exploring here. And you're using right from the beginning, I've loved this, the 4 pillars that I've just shared as kind of your lenses to say, okay, what's been done? What are the outcomes? And how are we going forward? Just unpack for us a little bit about how these 4 outcomes have helped you maybe see and take leadership there at the church so far.
Yeah, these have been a beautiful lens for me to look through, and one by which I can have conversation and help to measure. It's also been very difficult as we've been looking at it. I mean, so just for starters, we've had a recent pastoral change. Which is great in a lot of ways because there's not a lot of tradition or so on. And at the same time, that transition happened right in the middle of COVID. And so we had to take on these realities of what normally we used to measure church on was taken away immediately. I mean, literally the first Sunday that our pastor was literally head pastor was he preached from his living room. He introduced himself as our new head pastor from his living room, so nobody there, all sorts of metrics that we would have normally counted on are now gone. And it was a real struggle even to figure out, what are we doing? Are we even doing something here? But 2 things really came out of that. We became very aware that the current outputs that were going on at church, which used to be really just a Sunday service, maybe some random prayer times, small groups going on, which were good. We felt good about that. But when COVID happened and these realities, those things were stripped away, we could tell that people were still kind of left in a place where maybe healing hadn't taken place, where some angst or some anger, some anxiety about the reality of the world was going on. As we look at just these 4 pillars, I mean, the first one of loving God is really talking about a relationship with him, and to know that there's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and people having differences of relationship, or that they're in their own character, they're seeing that this aspect of God, maybe they don't know that well, but that got revealed, to us. And so not only were we seeing it revealed by COVID, but we realized that what was going on before wasn't working to develop maybe what we really wanted to see, were people loving others. Well, that in of itself on a larger church scale, but we've had to have our own conversations just with what it means to love others now that we've had, because of the things going on in our world. Transformation is healing happening. Well, no, I think, yes, healing's happening, but we're seeing even more so how much more it needs to take place. And we don't have the stuff necessary in order to really lead people down that path. So it's helping us think much wider and holistically about somebody's development. Service, absolutely, we have people serving, but are they being transformed? Are they in is their relationship with God deepening, or are they simply just doing? And that has also been revealed when the service has been taken away and people can't serve the way we used to. And now, oh my goodness, now what do I do? Wait a minute, what about these other places that we can focus on? So it's really given us it's opened our eyes. We've been able to assess better the things that we're doing. And I mean, again, not that all of it was wrong, but we put it in its right place. Now we understand better the place of the Sunday service and are now trying to find more opportunities to lean into the healing that is needed.
No, it's Brandon. As you share, I'm coming back to the metaphor of the recipe. It's almost like what I'm hearing you say is that it's not that every ingredient, every output of a church didn't fit into the recipe, but maybe the COVID reality has gone further to reveal that maybe there's some missing elements in the recipe, and if the ingredients aren't mixed right together and that they're separated, that maybe they don't have the the output, the outcome of what comes out of the oven is not what the church has hoped. And maybe that's part of the gift of the COVID reality, is it's forced us to see maybe some holes in the recipe that we wouldn't have so easily seen before.
Right. Yeah. Not only to see the holes in the recipe where there are places that are missing, but to take more account of some other places where I was just having a conversation with John, where he was wondering about the success metrics for himself and realizing that what he used to base it on is all gone. But then he's
Right.
talking to me about how he's meeting with over half of the congregation one-on-one throughout the week, how he's meeting with several different pastors in the community, how he's getting connected. And I was like, dude, how, were you doing that beforehand? I mean, these are the things that we would talk about as we would think about the growth of a church, and it's happening. These things are happening now much differently and much slowly. So the reality of this recipe and this kind of reset has been beautiful for us to encounter. And
Yeah, Brandon, you bring up a great story about John that makes me think of a recent story that Richard Matura and I have shared with a pastor in the north of Kenya named John, who grew up his entire life hearing sermons and as a pastor giving sermons and essentially revolving church around the Sunday morning service as the pivot. COVID comes, he's come to the Kingdom Story training. He understands the role of participating and not just preaching at people, but he also did our discipleship class and realized the importance of being with people one-on-one and not just in church. So he decided to take his car when the church couldn't come to him and the services were canceled. He started going to 3 families every Sunday, Brandon. This is amazing. And he would spend a couple hours with each. And after some tea, of course, some initial conversation, he did a Kingdom Story Bible, he did a participatory Bible study where everybody got involved, everybody shared. And he said it has made the word come alive to them. It's made his ministry feel different. And he says the church is growing, which is not a bad thing, right? That more people come, but they're coming for different reasons. I mean, the fact that they're getting involved and linking in. And as the churches start opening up again, he's realized that again, a missing ingredient. And now that personal side woven in has changed the recipe for him. So,
yeah, and I mean, those ingredients make sense. And even the recipe as to how you put it together when you realize the outcome that you want is
right.
banana bread, not just simply ingredients thrown in a bowl that'll come out with just hot bananas and weird
Right.
flour and stuff put together. And that's that kind of leads me to my next question, John, is so what are the dangers, or how might you describe what the danger would be if we continue to either not define the goals well or simply just look at outputs? How many am I putting out a good service every
Right.
Sunday versus transformation? What's the danger behind not identifying good outcomes, or
Mm.
not that we've identified them, Jesus has identified them for us, but
Yeah.
to keep that in the forefront? What happens if we don't keep that
Well,
focus?
you could think about somebody with an arrow. They could just start shooting the arrow and then circling the target around whatever where the arrow lands. In other words, we can begin to mission drift, and that's historically the church has circled it. The arrow lands around how many people are coming, or do we have a good building that's clean, or do we have money in the bank? The ABCs. So I think that's the same thing as that I mentioned before. If a football coach, for example, measures the success of his team only by the number of people on the team and in the fans, that they're going to long run, they're going to drift away. They're going to start losing the game. They're going to start losing to their opponents. And what happens to the coach is they're going to start losing motivation. And the people who come are either going to have to decide, well, we really weren't meant to win the game, and they just settle, So I think when the outcomes and the outputs don't match to make us more like Jesus, the health of the church is at risk, the health of the pastors, the influence of people, outside of the church to, quote, win games, the game of influence is deeply affected. And the lives of people are, as the world looks at our lives, they don't see a large difference. So I think what's at stake is the role of the church, God's plan of redemption. Of course, he's sovereign and he'll do whatever he needs to do in the end. But I think it breaks his heart that when his bride, that is meant to be salt and light, ends up kind of giving up, so to speak, the high exalted purposes and these outcomes that we were meant to move towards over our lifetime.
Yeah. And I thank you for that, John. I think that's a great analogy. And I think it's imperative that we come to this in prayer and with humility, even around, how we can look at some of these outcomes and goals. I mean, it just another example to help illustrate this that it has just sat with me recently is, when Henry Ford really rolled off that car, way back when, and we started using automobile, the point was more about money and about speed. It was not about safety and economic soundness and environmental friendliness. Those were not the goals.
Right.
And so we have suffered over all of these years because the goal was to make money and for the car to go fast. And now we've suffered through death. We've suffered through so many accidents. And only now are we beginning to create cars that are safe, that are environmentally friendly, that are economically sound for us. But that wasn't the goal. And so, I mean, church can suffer the same thing if we put these goals, but we really just want to go fast and make money versus wanting to think, the other side of it. So, I mean, the defining those goals and making sure we're staying on target rather than drawing the target around our arrow, I think is important.
And again, Brandon, it's true for sports, it's true for business, it's true for any good discipline, any good institution, what we're talking about. And what happens often is that the church environment, I think it's one of the few places, in the world, the few institutions where the people who will pay their leaders not to change anything. That would you please, consciously or unconsciously, this is a safe place. We kind of like things the way they are. We'll pay you not to change things. And as opposed to saying, if we don't make money, if we don't stay focused on our outcomes, we will go out of business. The church can stay in business without being aligned. And I think that would be one of the things I would want to end with.
Yeah. It's important for anything in life that we learn to evaluate ourselves rightly. Remember, the call is to make disciples who make disciples. We want people to become like Jesus in every way over a lifetime and teach others to do the same. John, is there anything else that you would like to add before we sign off?
Yeah, just a reminder that the grace and truth in all of this. I know it's true in my own life. A lot of what we're saying here has the idea of reclaiming the truth. The reality is that there's a ton of grace in this. It's a lifelong process. It's messy. It's not as clear cut, as football and some of the things that we've mentioned of business or a recipe. And so there is more mystery in the discipleship process. And so we got to give ourselves grace, but I wouldn't want to let us go off the hook and just say it's kind of marshmallow, unclear. No, there are some things that we can say are real outcomes, real signs that we're becoming more like Jesus. Let's find and discover and pursue those in the Spirit of Christ over the lifetime of our work with people.
Yeah, amen. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today as we continue to, walk this adventure called life. We wouldn't want it. John and I don't want to be anywhere else, but in the thick of this with you all, we are in it together. I just have to pause, John. When I first met John, he said that to me all the time. We're in it together, and it was a very comforting statement because, nobody's above this. We are all trying to figure this out.
Amen.
And just like John and I say, we're just two disciples.
Yep, trying to find our place in God's story. Good to be with you, Brandon.
Yep, good to be with you, John. Everyone else, be blessed.